They thought sending her away would break her. But on that prairie, her story was only beginning. The wagon wheels groaned as they rolled over ruts carved deep into the earth, each turn carrying Clara farther from the life she had once known and deeper into exile. She kept her shawl tight around her shoulders, though the evening wind still cut through sharp and merciless as the judgment that had fallen upon her. Her family had not looked back when they placed her on the wagon bench, their verdict spoken without tenderness. She would live with Elias Boone, the widower farmer, whose land lay at the far edge of the prairie. The horizon burned with the last traces of daylight, a thin strip of gold fading into violet shadow. When at last the wagon stopped, Clara raised her eyes to the house before her. It stood solitary, weathered and unyielding against the vast emptiness, its boards darkened by rain and years. There was no smoke curling from the chimney, no sign of welcome in the windows. Only silence and the long grass whispering in the wind. Elias Boone appeared in the doorway, broad-shouldered, his face carved deep by sun and sorrow. His eyes did not soften when they fell upon her. He gave no greeting, no word of comfort, only stepped aside with the stiff courtesy of a man fulfilling an unwanted duty. Clara followed him in, her boots heavy on the wooden floor. He pointed her to a small back room where a straw mattress lay in shadow, then left her standing alone. She sat at the edge of the bed, the boards creaking beneath her weight, hands folded, over the swell of her stomach. Beyond the thin wall she heard the scrape of a chair and the slow rhythm of wood rocking against wood. It was the only sound in the house. The smell of dust and old ash clung to the air. Clara lowered her head and closed her eyes. This place was not refuge, but a sentence. Her family had cast her away, and now she was a burden laid at the feet of a stranger who had no reason to want her here. She felt the weight of abandonment settle over her shoulders like a second shawl, heavier than the first, and Elias, seated in his rocking chair, listened to the quiet behind the closed door. He had taken her in because honor left him no choice. Yet already he felt the walls close tighter, another soul under his roof. Another reminder that life had dealt him loss he had never asked for. He let the chair creak beneath him, steady, measured, his gaze fixed on the dying fire. To him she was another burden. To her he was a warden. Between them only silence stretched, sharp and cold as frost. Days fell into a rhythm as steady as the ticking of a clock, though no such clock marked the hours in that lonely farmhouse. Clara rose before the sun, the chill of dawn biting at her cheeks as she stepped into the yard. The chickens stirred at her approach, feathers rustling in the dim light, and she scattered feed with slow, deliberate motions. Afterward, she hauled water from the well, her palms roughening on the rope, the weight of the bucket straining her arms. Elias was already in the fields by then, his figure bent low against the wide expanse of earth, a solitary silhouette plowing through silence. They spoke little, a few words exchanged over meals, a question asked and answered without warmth. Yet in the silence, Clara began to notice things, faint traces of another life layered beneath the present. The house was not empty, not truly. A woman's presence lingered in the worn wood and faded fabric, a ghost in every corner. In the front room, a rocking chair stood near the hearth, its arms polished smooth from use. On a high shelf, carefully placed though dulled by dust, a half-woven braid of dried sweetgrass hung like a fragile relic. And in a cedar chest at the foot of Elias's bed, which she glimpsed one afternoon while tidying, lay a wedding dress folded with painful care, its lace yellowed by years. Clara never asked about these things, but they pressed upon her like whispers. The air seemed to carry the memory of a woman gone, her absence filling the rooms more than her presence ever could. It explained the way Elias moved, measured, rigid, as if each gesture were a wall built higher against remembering. One evening, when the sun had long set and the lamps burned low, Clara stepped softly into the main room and saw Elias there. He sat by the chest, the wedding dress unfolded across his lap. His rough, work-hardened hands trembled as they touched the fabric. His head bowed, his face lined with grief he did not show by day. He seemed older then, hollowed out, as though time had carved him down to this moment of quiet surrender. Clara froze in the doorway, breath held. She did not mean to spy, but something in her heart pulled her to witness it. The coldness she had felt from him shifted in that instant. It was not cruelty, but armor. Grief hammered into hardness so it would not shatter him. She understood, it in her own way. Her own burden lay beneath her shawl, growing heavier with each passing day, a secret that was no secret at all. She carried her shame in silence just as he carried his loss. She stepped back before he could notice her, retreating into the dimness of her small room. Sitting on her straw mattress, she pressed her hands to her belly, feeling the faint stir within. The child would come into a world already shaped by sorrow, but perhaps, just perhaps, sorrow could be softened by the quiet dignity of endurance. And Elias, left alone with the dress, folded it again with care, his hands lingering as though the fabric might dissolve if he pressed too hard. He did not see the girl in the shadows. Yet in the days that followed, he caught himself watching her differently, not as a burden forced upon him, but as someone who, though cast away, carried herself with a silence that spoke of strength, a silence that, in some unspoken way, mirrored his own. The storm came without warning, rolling over the prairie like a beast loosed from the heavens. Wind howled through the grass, bending it flat, and rain struck the roof in heavy sheets that rattled the boards. The windows shivered in their frames and the chimney moaned with the force of it. Clara sat by the small fire, shawl drawn around her shoulders, listening to the fury outside. Her hand rested on her belly, steadying herself against the child's, restless stirring. Elias moved with quiet efficiency, checking the shutters, laying another log on the flames, his face set in grim concentration. A knock came then. No, not a knock, but a pounding. Heavy, insistent like a fist demanding entry. Both froze. Elias lifted his head, eyes narrowing before striding to the door. Clara rose too, her pulse quickening, but stayed behind the table as he pulled the door open. On the threshold stood a man, tall and ragged, rain streaming from his hat and coat. A rifle hung from his shoulder and hunger burned in his eyes. His voice, when it came, was roughened by whiskey and the road. "Shelter," he barked. "Food, something to drink." Elias's reply was calm but hard. "Move on. Nothing for—" "You hear?" The man shoved at the door, forcing himself half inside. Water spilled from his boots onto the floorboards. "Don't play righteous, farmer," he sneered. "I see your fire, I see your bread." His gaze shifted past Elias, catching sight of Clara. His grin widened, crooked, and mean. "And I see you've company." Clara's breath caught and she pulled the shawl tighter around her frame. Elias moved then, quick as the storm itself, stepping between her and the stranger. His hand rested on the rifle propped near the door. His voice carried the weight of iron. "You'll leave now." The storm seemed to answer, lashing harder against the house, rattling the shutters like bones. The stranger's eyes narrowed, testing the farmer's resolve, his hand twitching near his weapon. For a long moment, the room held its breath. Clara pressed her back to the wall, heart hammering, her unborn child shifting inside her as though sensing the danger. Finally, Elias shoved the man back across the threshold, seized the rifle from the wall, and leveled it with steady hands. "I said, leave." The drifter cursed, rain plastering his hair to his forehead, before spitting into the mud and stumbling away into the storm. The wind swallowed him, carrying his figure into darkness. Elias slammed the door shut, bolting it, and leaned his weight against the wood. His shoulders rose and fell with each breath, and Clara saw for the first time the tremor in his hands. Yet his gaze, when he turned it toward her, was steady, clear, and unflinching. The fire crackled between them, throwing shadows across the walls. Clara could not speak. All she could do was clutch her belly, relief and fear tangled together like the storm outside. She looked at him not as the harsh farmer she had been forced upon, but as a wall of flesh and bone who had stood between her and harm. Later that night, when the storm had lessened to a weary drizzle, Clara lay in her bed, staring into the darkness. From beneath her door came a faint glow. Rising quietly, she opened it just enough to see. In the hallway, a single lamp burned, left there by Elias. He did not knock, did not speak, did not intrude, but the light stayed through the night, a silent vigil, a wordless shield. For the first time since her exile began, Clara slept without fear. The storm passed, but its echo remained, leaving the air between them altered in ways neither dared to name. The days unfolded much the same: chores, silence, the endless sweep of prairie, but something softer began to move beneath the surface. Clara hummed while she worked, small tunes without words drifting over the clatter of the chicken yard or the rhythm of sweeping floors. Elias never acknowledged it, but when he passed by, he lingered in the doorway longer than before, listening, without appearing to. One morning she found her water pail mended, the iron hoop tightened, the crack sealed. Elias had left it by the well without a word. Another day, when he laid a stack of worn shirts on the table, she noticed the seams split and fraying. Without asking, she set to sewing them in the evenings, her needle glinting in the lamplight. When he wore them again, the thread showed neat against the fabric, her work plain but careful. He said nothing, but he kept them folded on top of his chest rather than buried beneath. The silence between them no longer cut so sharply. It bent, instead, softening into a strange companionship, like two trees growing near enough their roots began to tangle unseen beneath the soil. Still, tension lingered. Clara caught his eyes once or twice, flicking toward the curve of her belly before he turned away, his jaw tightening. She lowered her head then, shame prickling her skin, though she carried herself with quiet dignity. Elias wrestled with his own unease. Guilt that he noticed her presence not only as burden, but as warmth. The smell of bread baking in the hearth, the glow of lamplight spilling from her small room. These things stitched life back into the hollow house, and he did not know what to do with the comfort they brought. One evening, Clara sat by the fire after supper, her sewing basket at her feet. Weariness overcame her, and before she realized it, her head had drooped, her hand still resting in her lap. The flames flickered across her face, casting it in a gentle glow. Elias watched her from his chair, his chest tightening with something he could not name. Quietly he rose and fetched a quilt from the corner. He draped it over her shoulders, careful not to wake her, his hand lingering for the briefest moment against the fabric near her arm. Then, as though burned by his own tenderness, he drew back quickly and returned to his place by the fire. The rocking chair groaned beneath his weight, steady as his breath, though his thoughts were restless. The flames painted his weathered face, in shifting light and shadow, and in their glow, the house no longer felt haunted by absence alone. Something fragile was taking root, too quiet to be named, too dangerous to be spoken, but present all the same. Clara stirred in her sleep, pulling the quilt tighter. For the first time, she dreamed not of abandonment, but of shelter. And Elias sat wakeful long into the night, listening to the fire crackle, the emptiness in his home slowly, almost unwillingly, beginning to fill. Winter arrived before its time, slipping over the prairie like a hush that would not lift. Snow began to fall in slow, unbroken sheets, blanketing the earth in silence. The wind no longer roared, it whispered, carrying cold through the cracks, in the walls and settling into the corners of the house. Days shortened and firelight became the heart of their small world. Clara moved slower now, her body heavy, her hands resting often on her belly as though to anchor herself against the weight of what was to come. Elias chopped wood daily, stacking it high against the wall, the axe striking rhythm into the frozen air. They spoke little still, but their quiet held warmth now. The house smelled of burning pine and rising bread, the air softened by the low hum of the stove and the occasional crackle from the hearth. And yet, beneath the quiet, something waited. It was evening when the pain struck, sharp, sudden, deep. Clara gasped, hand flying to her side, the cup she held clattering to the floor. Elias was beside her in an instant, his eyes wide but steady. "It's time?" he asked, voice low. She nodded, breath quickening. The hours that followed blurred into shadow and flame. Elias boiled water, laid out cloth, stoked the fire until the stones glowed red. Snow pressed against the windows, muting the world beyond. The only sounds inside were Clara's ragged breathing, the kettle's hiss, the low crack of wood in the fire. Elias knelt beside her, his large hands uncharacteristically gentle, wiping her brow, murmuring quiet reassurances he did not know. He still carried. Time dissolved. It could have been hours or a lifetime that passed beneath the sway of the lantern. Sweat beaded on Clara's temples. She gripped the edge of the quilt, teeth clenched, heart thundering with fear and fierce. "Will?" Elias remained steadfast as a post, though his own hands trembled when he thought she couldn't see. And then, dawn broke. Pale light seeped through the snow-frosted panes. A single cry pierced the silence, sharp and high and full of life. The sound rang through the house like a bell. Clara's face crumpled, tears spilling freely as she gathered the small, wrinkled bundle to her chest. A son. Her son. Warm. Breathing. Real. She clutched him close, sobbing softly into the crown of his damp hair. Elias sat back on his heels, sweat streaking the lines of his face, his breath caught somewhere between awe and exhaustion. He stared at the child, this fragile, wriggling miracle he had helped deliver, and something in him shifted. The house, long hollowed by grief and silence, now echoed with new breath. He reached out, brushing one rough finger along the baby's tiny fist. "A strong little man," he whispered, voice thick, the words breaking slightly as they left his throat. His eyes glistened in the firelight, and for a moment, all the years of solitude hung suspended, then slowly began to loosen their hold. Clara looked at him then, really looked. Not as the man who had been assigned to bear her, but as someone who had stood beside her through the fiercest night, whose hands had held the line between fear and survival. She saw gentleness where once she saw stone, and she felt with aching clarity that she was no longer alone. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm orange glow across the wooden beams, the sleeping child, the rocking chair still swaying from the night's vigil. The snow lay thick outside, muffling all sound, but inside the house pulsed with quiet life. For the first time, there was warmth not only in the hearth, but in the space between them. The thaw of spring loosened the prairie from its grip of ice. The winds softened, though the air still carried the bite of lingering cold. Clara's son grew stronger by the day, his small fists curling around her finger, his cries now carrying, not fear but insistence. She had found her rhythm, feeding, rocking, whispering soft words into the quiet of night. Elias moved about the farm with the same steady gait, but Clara noticed how his steps slowed when he passed near the cradle, how his hand would brush the child's blanket as if to test the weight of life within it. Silence still hung between them, but it had shifted, no longer empty but thick with unspoken understanding. When Clara's family came, they brought the sharpness of judgment with them. The knock at the door was not timid, but hard, echoing through the small house. Clara froze, the baby pressed to her chest while Elias opened the door. Her father stepped inside without asking, boots stomping across the floorboards, his face worn deep with lines of pride and disdain. Behind him trailed her brothers, their eyes hard, their mouths set as if they had rehearsed their sneers on the long ride. "So this is where you've hidden," her father said, looking her over with a scornful eye. "I wondered how long it would take before you sent word begging for scraps, but I see you've found yourself a roof to sulk under." His gaze flicked to Elias, then down to the child in Clara's arms. And him, a farmer willing to take in damaged goods. The words cut, sharp as barbed wire. Clara's breath caught, but before she could speak, Elias's voice filled the room. Calm, low, solid as oak. "No woman carrying life is damaged." He did not raise his voice, but the firmness of it struck harder than thunder. His hands, roughened from years of labor, rested still at his sides, but his eyes held steady on the man who had traded his daughter away like livestock. And no child should ever be spoken of as shame. The room quieted, Even the baby hushed, as if sensing the weight of the words. Clara's father shifted, his mouth opening to retort, but nothing came. The silence he had tried to wield now pressed back against him. Her brothers glanced at each other, uncertain. Clara felt heat rise in her chest, not of humiliation, but of strength she had not known she carried. She straightened, rocking her son gently, and met her father's eyes with calm defiance. "I am not coming back," she said, her voice soft, but steady. "This is my home now." Her father scoffed, muttering under his breath, and turned toward the door. One by one, the others followed, boots striking against the boards, leaving behind the scent of horse and dust. No farewell, no blessing, only absence. When the door closed, the house was quiet again. Clara's heart pounded, but she did not falter. Elias lingered a moment by the door, then turned back to her. His face was unreadable, but the look he gave her carried something wordless, something that settled deeper than speech. The next morning, Elias readied the wagon. The sun was only beginning to rise, casting a pale gold across the prairie. Clara wrapped her son in a shawl, pulling it tight against the wind. She climbed into the seat beside Elias, the wooden boards creaking under their weight. The baby stirred, then stilled against her chest. Elias flicked the reins and the horses moved forward, hooves crunching over the dirt road still damp from the last rain. The fields stretched wide, endless, no longer barren but open, holding promise instead of emptiness. Clara let the wind brush her face, its chill no longer cruel but alive, carrying scents of earth and grass, of distance and horizon. She glanced sideways at Elias. His profile was etched against the morning light, lines carved deep from years of labor and solitude. His hands were steady on the reins, guiding the horses with quiet certainty. For a moment, his eyes flicked to hers, just once. Enough. The look said everything, that he had chosen to stand beside her when no one else would, that he had found something worth protecting again, that words were too small for what had been built between them. Clara pressed her cheek against her son's head and let her breath steady. She was no longer the girl her father had left behind. She was more. The wagon rolled on, carrying them across the prairie, not into a life of ease, but into one they would forge together, strong and unspoken, bound by survival, trust, and a quiet fire that needed no name.